Ever feel like something's watching you from just beyond where the light reaches? That feeling when the hairs on your neck stand up for no reason you can name? Before we dive into this, tell me in the comments, have you ever seen something you couldn't explain? Something that made you question what's real? Drop your location too. I love knowing where our listeners are tuning in from tonight. The autumn of 1966 settled over Point Pleasant, West Virginia, like a heavy blanket. The town sat tucked between the Ohio River and the dense Appalachian hills, a place where the morning mist hung so thick you could barely see your own hands in front of you. It was a town of about 6,000 souls, most of them working at the chemical plants or the power station, living quiet lives in the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business. The leaves had turned that year into brilliant reds and golds, carpeting the hillsides in color, but there was something different in the air that fall. Something that made people lock their doors a little earlier, glance over their shoulders a little more often, though most couldn't say exactly why. The old TNT plant sat about 7 miles north of town, a relic from the war years when they'd manufactured explosives for the effort overseas. Back in the 40s, the government had built it fast and built it cheap, a sprawling complex of concrete igloos and manufacturing buildings spread across nearly 9,000 acres of dense woodland. By '66, it had been abandoned for more than a decade, left to rot and decay in the West Virginia wilderness. The locals called it the TNT area, and most folks avoided it. The place had a reputation. Strange lights had been reported there for years, odd sounds carrying through the trees at night. But in a coal mining region where methane gas and unexploded ordnance were real concerns, people found rational explanations and went about their lives. Rutherford Crane worked as a diesel mechanic at the power plant just outside Point Pleasant. He was 31 years old that November, a tall man with a lean build and hands perpetually stained with engine grease no amount of scrubbing could fully remove. His face was all sharp angles, cheekbones that cast shadows even in bright light, and his eyes were a pale green that seemed to look right through whatever he was focused on. He'd lived in Point Pleasant his whole life, born in a house 3 blocks from where he lived now with his wife, Lenora. She worked at the 5 and Dime on Main Street, a job that kept her on her feet all day, but let her chat with just about everyone in town. They'd been married 8 years, and by all accounts, they were content. Rutherford was the kind of man who kept to himself mostly, spoke when spoken to, did his work, and did it well. People respected that about him. On the night of November 15th, Rutherford was working late at the plant. A generator had gone down that afternoon, and the foreman needed it back up before the morning shift. The work was tedious, replacing gaskets and checking compression, the kind of thing that required concentration and patience. By the time he finished, it was past 11 at night. He cleaned his tools, washed his hands as best he could, and headed out to his truck, a '58 Chevrolet Apache with more rust than paint, but an engine he kept running smooth as silk. The route home took him north on Route 62 before he cut east toward town. It was a clear night, cold enough that his breath fogged in the air, stars sharp and bright overhead. The radio in his truck had stopped working months ago, so he drove in silence, except for the rumble of the engine and the whisper of tires on asphalt. As he passed the turnoff to the old TNT area, he noticed something that made him slow down. Lights. Not the yellow-white of headlights or the orange glow of a campfire, but something else. Something that pulsed red and seemed to move between the trees about a quarter-mile off the road. Rutherford pulled over onto the shoulder and killed his engine. The lights continued their strange dance, appearing and disappearing behind the bare trunks of November trees. He sat there for maybe 5 minutes, watching, trying to figure out what he was seeing. Could be kids messing around, he thought, though that seemed unlikely this far from town, this late at night. Could be someone hunting illegally, using some kind of modified lamp. But the way the lights moved didn't match any explanation he could settle on. They seemed to hover, to drift in patterns that felt almost deliberate. He started his truck back up and continued home, but the lights stayed with him in his mind. When he walked through his front door, Lenora was still awake, reading a magazine at the kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold beside her. She looked up when he came in, and something in his expression made her set the magazine down. "What's wrong?" she asked, and he told her about the lights. She listened without interrupting, then suggested it might have been marsh gas or some chemical reaction from all the old explosives buried out there. It was a reasonable explanation, and Rutherford wanted to accept it, but something about what he'd seen felt different from anything natural or chemical. The following week, on November 21st, 4 people would have an experience that would change Point Pleasant forever, though Rutherford wouldn't know about it until the day after. 2 young couples, all in their early 20s, had been driving near the TNT area that Tuesday night. Wendell Finch and his girlfriend Darlene, along with Wendell's brother Hobart and Hobart's girlfriend Marissa, had taken Wendell's car out for a late-night drive, the kind of thing young people did in a town where entertainment options were limited. They'd been cruising the back roads, talking and laughing, when they decided to drive through the old TNT plant area on a dare, the kind of stupid thing you do when you're young and trying to impress each other. The abandoned facility looked even more desolate at night. The concrete domes where they'd stored explosives rose from the earth like giant mushrooms pale in the moonlight. Old buildings with broken windows and doors hanging off their hinges lined the crumbling roads. Wendell drove slowly, his headlights cutting through the darkness, revealing rusted equipment and overgrown vegetation. They were maybe a mile into the complex when Darlene, sitting in the passenger seat, let out a sound that was half gasp, half scream. There, standing beside one of the old generator buildings, was something that shouldn't exist. It stood upright like a man, but it was massive, well over 6 feet tall, even in its slightly hunched posture. Its body seemed almost human in shape, but the proportions were wrong, the torso too thick, the limbs too long. But what froze everyone in that car, what made even Wendell's hands shake on the steering wheel, were the eyes. 2 enormous eyes that glowed bright red in the headlight's beam, reflecting the light back like an animal's would. But these were different. They were huge, each one the size of a saucer, and they didn't blink. They just stared with an intensity that felt almost intelligent, almost aware. And then it spread its wings. The span had to be 10 feet, maybe more, great dark shapes that unfolded from its back like some massive bird of prey. But no bird moved like this thing moved. It didn't flap or flutter. It rose straight up into the air, those red eyes never leaving the car. And Wendell later swore to anyone who'd listen that the thing made no sound, no rustling of feathers, no cry or call, just an impossible silence as it lifted itself skyward. Wendell punched the accelerator, and the car fish-tailed on the loose gravel before finding purchase and shooting forward. He drove like hell itself was chasing them, and maybe it was, because when Hobart twisted around to look out the back window, the creature was following them. It stayed above the car, matching their speed, those burning red eyes visible even in the darkness. Wendell pushed the car to over 100 miles per hour on those winding back roads, a speed that should have killed them all when they took the curves. But somehow the tires held, and they stayed on the pavement. The creature kept pace effortlessly. Only when they reached the outskirts of Point Pleasant, when the first street lights appeared and the houses of the town came into view, did the thing finally veer away, banking into the sky and disappearing over the tree line toward the river. Wendell didn't stop until he pulled up in front of the Mason County Courthouse, where he knew there'd be a deputy on duty. All four of them stumbled out of the car, shaking, trying to make sense of what they'd just experienced. Deputy Roscoe Harmon was working the night shift that Tuesday, mostly keeping an eye on things and drinking coffee to stay awake during the quiet hours. He was 47 years old, a career lawman who'd seen his share of strange situations, but considered himself a practical man with little patience for nonsense. When four terrified young people came bursting into the courthouse at 1 a.m, wild-eyed and talking over each other about some kind of monster near the TNT plant, his first instinct was to assume they'd been drinking or taken something they shouldn't. But when he really looked at them, when he saw how genuinely frightened they were, how their stories matched in every detail, he started to wonder if maybe something had actually happened out there. He took their statements carefully, writing down everything they described: the size of the creature, the red eyes, the wings, the impossible way it had followed their car. When he asked if they'd been drinking, all four denied it, and he believed them. These weren't kids looking for attention or trying to pull some kind of prank. These were people who'd seen something that had fundamentally shaken them, something they couldn't explain and desperately wanted someone else to make sense of. Harmon filed the report, though he wasn't sure what exactly to file it under. By morning, word had spread through Point Pleasant like wildfire. A small-town newspaper, the Point Pleasant Register, got hold of the story, and by evening it was front-page news. The reporter who wrote it, a woman named Judith Pemberton, had interviewed the four witnesses separately and come away convinced they were telling the truth as they understood it. She was the one who gave the creature its name, drawing on folklore and her own sense of what would capture readers' attention. She called it the Mothman, and just like that, everything changed. Now, before we continue, this story is brought to you by Behind Dark Tales. If you're enjoying this, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. And hey, if you're hearing this on some other channel right now, just know they stole our content without permission. Report it for us, would you? We put a lot of work into bringing you these stories. Rutherford Crane read about the sighting in the paper the next morning over breakfast. Lenora had already left for work, and he sat alone at the kitchen table, his coffee growing cold as he read the article twice, then a third time. The description of the creature matched nothing he knew from nature or folklore, but those red lights he'd seen moving through the trees near the TNT area the week before suddenly felt more significant. He hadn't seen any creature, hadn't seen those enormous glowing eyes. But what if what he'd witnessed had been this thing whatever it was, moving through the woods. The sightings didn't stop with that first report. Over the next several days, more people came forward with their own experiences. A woman named Cordelia Winslow, 63 years old and a retired school teacher known for her no-nonsense demeanor, reported seeing a large winged figure pass in front of her bedroom window on the night of November 22nd. She lived alone in a house that backed up to a wooded area on the eastern edge of town, and she'd been getting ready for bed when movement outside caught her eye. The figure had been silhouetted against the moonlight, wings spread wide, but moving in complete silence. She'd stood frozen at her window for several minutes after it passed, wondering if her eyes had deceived her. But the image was too clear, too specific to dismiss as imagination. A construction worker named Dalton Kemper, 28 years old with shoulders like a linebacker and hands calloused from years of hard labor, was driving home from a poker game on November 24th when he saw something crouched on the roof of an abandoned warehouse near the river. He slowed his truck to get a better look, and the thing turned its head to look back at him. Two massive red eyes caught his headlights, and Dalton later told the deputy who took his statement that those eyes seemed to look into him, not just at him. The creature had launched itself from the roof and flown directly over his truck, so close he could see details he wished he couldn't. The body was gray-brown, the texture almost like leather. The wings weren't feathered but membranous, like a bat's, only much larger. It had been gone in seconds, disappearing into the night sky, but Dalton had sat in his truck for 20 minutes afterward, trying to convince himself he'd really seen it. By the end of November, the Point Pleasant Register had documented over a dozen separate sightings, and people from all walks of life were coming forward. Factory workers, housewives, businessmen, farmers. The witnesses shared certain details. The size of the creature, usually described as between 6 and 7 feet tall. The wingspan, estimated at 10 feet or more. The distinctive red eyes that seemed to glow from within rather than simply reflecting light. The uncanny silence with which it moved. And most unsettling of all, the sense that it was watching, observing, studying the people it encountered. The national press picked up the story in early December. Reporters from newspapers in Charleston and Cincinnati descended on Point Pleasant, interviewing witnesses and exploring the TNT area. Some came looking for a serious story about a genuine mystery. Others came looking for a laugh, ready to mock the backwards mountain folk who believed in monsters. The town found itself divided. Some people were embarrassed by the attention, worried that Point Pleasant would become a laughingstock. Others were fascinated, energized by the idea that something truly unknown might be lurking in their midst. And a very few, were terrified in a way that went beyond simple fear of a strange animal. They felt something darker at work, something that went deeper than a mere cryptid sighting. Rutherford found himself oddly drawn to the mystery. He wasn't a fanciful man. He believed in what he could see and touch and understand through reason. But the accumulation of credible sightings, the consistency in the descriptions, the fact that many of the witnesses were people he knew personally and trusted, all of it pushed against his natural skepticism. He started driving past the TNT area more frequently, taking the long way home from work, scanning the tree line and the sky for any sign of the creature. He never told Lenora about these detours. She was already worried enough, jumping at shadows and insisting they keep all the curtains drawn after dark. On December 7th, Rutherford had his second encounter with something unexplainable, though it wasn't the creature itself. He'd stopped at a gas station on the edge of town to fill up his truck, and while the attendant worked the pump, Rutherford went inside to buy cigarettes. A man was standing at the counter paying for his own gas, and when he turned around, Rutherford got a good look at him. He was unusual in a way that was hard to define. Average height, average build, wearing a black suit that looked expensive, but somehow wrong, like it didn't quite fit the way a suit should. His face was pale, almost colorless, and his movements were stiff, mechanical, as if he had to think about each gesture before making it. The man looked directly at Rutherford, and his eyes were wrong, too. Too dark, too still. No expression crossed his face, but he spoke in a flat, emotionless voice that asked, "Have you seen it?" Rutherford didn't need to ask what it meant. He shook his head no, which was technically true since he'd only seen the lights, not the creature itself. The man continued to stare for another moment, then said, "It's watching. It's always watching now." He walked out of the station and got into a black Cadillac that looked brand new, driving away without turning on his headlights even though night had fallen. The attendant, a local guy named Pete, who Rutherford had known for years, came inside shaking his head. "Strange fella," Pete said. "Paid with brand new bills that felt weird. Too crisp, you know." And he asked me the same thing. "Have you seen it?" Like he already knew the answer. They talked for a few more minutes about the odd encounter, but neither of them could make sense of it. Point Pleasant was attracting strange visitors now, people drawn to the mystery, some genuinely curious, and some who seemed to have their own agendas. The sightings continued through December. Sometimes multiple people would see the creature on the same night in different parts of town. Sometimes weeks would go by with nothing. The pattern, if there was one, remained elusive. Rutherford started keeping a notebook, writing down each reported sighting he heard about, noting the date, location, and witness. He wasn't sure why he was doing it. Maybe he was looking for a pattern. Maybe he just needed to feel like he was doing something, taking some kind of action in the face of something that defied understanding. On December 15th, around 9 in the evening, Rutherford was in his garage working on his truck's transmission when Lenora called out to him from the back door. Her voice had an edge to it that made him drop his wrench and hurry inside. She was standing at the kitchen window, pointing toward the backyard. "There," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you see it?" Rutherford looked where she was pointing, and for a moment he saw nothing but the bare trees at the edge of their property, skeletal branches dark against the evening sky. Then something moved. A shape detached itself from the shadows between two old oaks and stepped into the clearing. It was enormous, upright, with those wings folded against its back. And the eyes, those terrible glowing red eyes, were looking directly at their house. Neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. They stood frozen at that kitchen window, watching as the creature tilted its head in a motion that seemed almost curious, almost questioning. It stood there for what felt like an eternity, but was probably no more than 30 seconds. Then, without warning, it spread those massive wings and launched itself straight up, rising vertically into the night sky, until it was lost among the stars. Rutherford and Lenora didn't talk about it that night. They went to bed in silence, lying awake in the darkness, both of them acutely aware of every sound the old house made as it settled. In the morning, Rutherford went out to the backyard to look for any sign that what they'd seen was real. The ground was partially frozen, but he found marks in the half-thawed earth near where the creature had stood. Not footprints exactly, but indentations that suggested something heavy had been there, something with three-toed feet that left deep gouges in the soil. He reported the sighting to Deputy Harmon, who added it to the growing file of encounters. Harmon had stopped being skeptical weeks ago. Too many credible witnesses, too many consistent details. Whatever was happening in Point Pleasant, it was real in the sense that people were genuinely experiencing something beyond their normal frame of reference. Whether that something was a biological creature, a psychological phenomenon, or something else entirely remained an open question. Have you ever had a moment where reality just shifted on you? Where something you saw changed the way you understood the world? Drop your story in the comments. I read every single one of them, and your experiences help others realize they're not alone in what they've witnessed. The winter deepened, and with it came a growing sense of unease throughout Point Pleasant. People started staying indoors after dark. Hardware stores reported selling out of heavy-duty locks and motion sensor lights. Church attendance increased as people sought comfort and answers in faith. Reverend Milton Graves at the First Baptist Church gave a sermon about the mysterious creature, interpreting it as a test of faith, a reminder that there were things in God's creation that humans weren't meant to understand. Some found comfort in that message. Others found it deeply unsettling. Rutherford's obsession with documenting the sightings intensified. His notebook filled with entries, dates, locations, patterns he thought he might be seeing. Most sightings occurred between 10 at night and 4 in the morning. Most happened within a 5-mile radius of the old TNT plant. Many witnesses reported feelings of dread or unease before seeing the creature, as if some part of their subconscious recognized its presence before their conscious mind registered it. But beyond these general observations, no clear pattern emerged. The creature, if that's what it was, seemed to appear randomly, targeting no specific type of person or location. In early January of 1967, a self-proclaimed expert arrived in Point Pleasant. His name was Wendell Barrows, and he introduced himself as a researcher of unexplained phenomena. He was in his mid-50s, overweight and balding, with thick glasses that magnified his eyes and a tendency to speak in long, rambling sentences full of technical jargon and references to cases from around the world. He set up shop in a room at the Lowe Hotel and began interviewing witnesses, taking measurements at sighting locations, and generally making a nuisance of himself with his grandiose claims and self-importance. Rutherford met with him once, mostly out of curiosity. Barrows looked at Rutherford's notebook with barely concealed disdain, pointing out what he saw as methodological flaws and missed opportunities. He had theories, dozens of them, ranging from undiscovered species of giant owl to interdimensional beings to government experiments gone wrong. Nothing was too outlandish for him to consider, and yet nothing satisfied him as the complete answer. Rutherford left the meeting feeling like he'd wasted an hour of his life listening to a man who loved the sound of his own voice more than he loved actual truth. But Barrows did bring one useful thing to Point Pleasant. He organized night watches at the TNT area. Groups of volunteers, usually 5 or 6 people, would spend several hours after dark at various locations throughout the abandoned complex, watching and waiting for the creature to appear. Rutherford joined one of these watches on January 14th, a bitterly cold night when the temperature hovered just above zero and the wind cut through even the thickest coat. The group included Barrows, Rutherford, Deputy Harmon, who was there in an unofficial capacity, and 3 other locals who'd had their own sightings. They set up near one of the old power stations, a hulking concrete structure with most of its windows broken out and ice forming on the exposed pipes. Barrows had brought recording equipment, cameras, and various instruments whose purpose Rutherford couldn't begin to guess. They waited in silence, their breath fogging in the frigid air, watching the darkness beyond their flashlight's reach. Around 11:30, something changed. Rutherford felt it before he could articulate what it was. The night had been filled with small sounds, wind through the trees, the occasional crack of ice breaking, the distant hoot of an owl. Suddenly, all of that stopped. Complete silence descended, so total and absolute that Rutherford could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. The others felt it too. He could see them straightening up, looking around with sudden alertness. Then the red lights appeared. Not the creature's eyes this time, but multiple points of light moving through the complex about 100 yards from their position. They drifted between buildings, pulsed and faded, appeared and disappeared in patterns that seemed almost choreographed. Barrows was frantically trying to capture them on film, muttering excitedly to himself as he adjusted his camera settings. Rutherford just watched, transfixed by the strangeness of it. The lights continued for perhaps 10 minutes, then vanished all at once, and with their disappearance, the normal sounds of the night returned. The wind picked up again. The owl resumed its calls. It was as if someone had turned the volume of the world back on after briefly muting it. They waited another 2 hours, but nothing else happened. As they packed up to leave, Barrows was nearly giddy with excitement, convinced he'd documented something revolutionary. Rutherford felt differently. What he'd witnessed hadn't answered any questions. It had only raised more. The sightings of the creature itself became less frequent in late January and February. Whether it had moved on, gone into some kind of hibernation, or simply stopped showing itself to people, no one could say. But the unease in Point Pleasant didn't diminish. If anything, it intensified. People reported strange dreams, vivid nightmares of falling bridges and flooding waters. Others complained of persistent headaches and feelings of impending doom they couldn't shake. The town doctor, a pragmatic man named Orville Kemp, who'd practiced medicine in Point Pleasant for 30 years, found himself prescribing more sleeping pills and anxiety medication than he ever had before. Rutherford's relationship with Lenora became strained. She wanted him to stop his investigations, to burn the notebook and forget about the whole thing. They'd seen the creature themselves, she argued, and knowing that was enough. Continuing to pursue it, to spend his evenings driving to the TNT area or talking with other witnesses, was making him obsessed in an unhealthy way. He knew she was right, but he couldn't stop. Something about the mystery had hooked itself into his mind and wouldn't let go. On March 10th, Rutherford had his final encounter with the creature, though he wouldn't realize it was the final one until much later. He was driving home from work, taking his usual route that passed near the TNT area, when his truck's engine suddenly died. No sputter, no cough, just an instant shutdown as if someone had flipped a switch. He coasted to a stop on the shoulder and tried to restart it, but nothing happened. The engine wouldn't even turn over. He got out to check under the hood, though he wasn't sure what good that would do in the dark with only a flashlight. That's when he realized how quiet it was. No wind, no insects, no distant traffic sounds, just profound, unnatural silence. He looked up, and it was there, perched on a telephone pole maybe 20 feet away, those massive red eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. The creature was huge, even larger than he'd imagined from the descriptions. Its wings were partially spread, as if it was considering flight. And in the beam of his flashlight, he could see details that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The texture of its skin, rough and almost scaled. The way its head sat on its shoulders without any visible neck. The talons on its feet, curved and wicked-looking. They stared at each other for what felt like hours, but was probably less than a minute. Rutherford felt rooted to the spot, unable to move even if he'd wanted to. Then the creature did something unexpected. It tilted its head, much as it had done when he and Lenora had seen it from their kitchen window, and he could have sworn he saw recognition in those glowing eyes, as if the creature knew him, as if it had been waiting for this specific encounter. Then it spoke. Rutherford would never be completely certain he actually heard words, or if the message appeared directly in his mind, bypassing his ears entirely. But he received communication, clear and unmistakable. They fall. That was all. 2 words, spoken or transmitted or somehow impressed upon his consciousness. They fall. The creature launched itself from the pole, those enormous wings spreading wide, and it flew directly over Rutherford's head so close he could feel the displacement of air. Then it was gone, disappearing into the night sky, and the moment it vanished, his truck's engine roared to life all on its own, even though the key wasn't in the ignition. He had to reach through the open door to turn it off, his hands shaking so badly he could barely grip the key. He drove home and told Lenora everything. She listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she said quietly, "We need to leave. We need to get out of Point Pleasant." But they didn't leave. They stayed, like almost everyone else in town, because leaving felt like admitting defeat, like acknowledging that something beyond their control had power over their lives. The creature wasn't seen again after that night in March. Sightings of the strange lights continued sporadically, and people still reported odd feelings and unexplained phenomena. But the Mothman itself, if that's what it truly was, had apparently departed. Wendell Barrows left town in April, his research incomplete and his theories unproven. Deputy Harmon filed away the incident reports and tried to return to normal police work. Rutherford went back to his job at the power plant and tried to focus on the familiar rhythm of his days. But "they fall" echoed in his mind constantly. He couldn't shake the feeling that the creature had been trying to warn him, trying to communicate something important. He just couldn't figure out what. Through the spring and summer of 1967, Point Pleasant tried to return to normal. The national press moved on to other stories. The tourists and curiosity seekers stopped coming. Life resumed its ordinary patterns, though anyone who'd experienced a sighting carried the memory with them, a small weight of knowledge that the world contained more mysteries than most people were willing to acknowledge. Rutherford continued documenting reports of strange phenomena, though they became increasingly rare. By fall, his notebook entries had dwindled to 1 or 2 a month, then none at all. He told himself he was over it, that he'd moved past his obsession, but he still drove by the TNT area sometimes, still scanned the night sky looking for those distinctive red eyes, still felt a tightness in his chest when the silence grew too deep. December arrived again, bringing with it the anniversary of the first documented sightings. The Point Pleasant Register ran a retrospective article, interviewing some of the original witnesses and asking what they thought now, a year later. Most said they still believed what they'd seen, though the memory had taken on a dreamlike quality with the passage of time. A few admitted they weren't sure anymore, that maybe fear and imagination had distorted what was probably just a large bird or some other mundane explanation. Rutherford didn't participate in the article. He'd said everything he had to say about his own experiences, and he didn't feel the need to rehash them for the public. He was more interested in the 2 words the creature had given him. They fall. He'd spent months trying to interpret the message, coming up with and discarding dozens of theories. Was it a warning? A prophecy? Simple words that he'd projected meaning onto because he desperately wanted the encounter to mean something. On December 15th, 1967, Point Pleasant held a small ceremony at the courthouse to mark the anniversary. Mayor Vincent Carver gave a brief speech about the resilience of the community and how they'd weathered an unusual year together. About 50 people attended, including many of the witnesses. There was an almost festive atmosphere, people laughing and sharing their stories. The fear that had gripped the town a year ago transformed into something almost nostalgic. Rutherford and Lenora attended. They stood at the back of the crowd, holding hands, listening to the mayor's words. When the ceremony ended, people began to disperse, heading to the diner for coffee or home to their families. Rutherford had parked their truck a few blocks away near the Silver Bridge. The Silver Bridge was Point Pleasant's main connection to Ohio, a suspension bridge that spanned the Ohio River and connected West Virginia to the small town of Gallipolis on the other side. It had been built in 1928, an impressive feat of engineering for its time, named for its aluminum paint that gave it a distinctive silvery sheen. Hundreds of cars crossed it every day. It was as much a part of Point Pleasant as the courthouse or the high school. As Rutherford and Lenora walked toward where they'd parked, Rutherford noticed something odd. Traffic on the bridge had stopped. Cars sat motionless in both directions, brake lights glowing red in the gathering darkness. He could see people getting out of their vehicles, looking around in confusion. Something was wrong with the bridge. Then he heard it, a sound like thunder, like the sky itself was tearing apart. Metal screaming against metal, and the bridge began to fall. It happened so slowly and so fast at the same time. The roadway twisted, buckled, segments dropping away into the river below. Cars tumbled off the collapsing structure, spinning end over end before hitting the freezing water. The suspension cables snapped with sounds like gunshots, whipping through the air. In less than a minute, the entire bridge had collapsed into the Ohio River, taking with it 37 vehicles and 64 people. Rutherford stood frozen, watching in horror as the disaster unfolded less than 100 yards from where he stood. The screams of the people in the water, the grinding of metal, the chaos and confusion, all of it seared itself into his memory with terrible clarity. Lenora was crying, her hands over her mouth, and all around them, people were running toward the river, trying to help, trying to save whoever they could. They fall. The creature's words came back to him with devastating clarity. The Mothman had known. It had tried to warn him, tried to warn all of them. But the message had been too cryptic, too vague for him to understand until it was too late. All those months of obsessively documenting sightings and trying to understand what the creature was, and he'd missed the most important thing. It had been trying to tell them something terrible was coming. The rescue efforts lasted through the night and into the next day. Divers went into the freezing water again and again, pulling out survivors when they could find them, bodies when they couldn't. The final death toll would be 46 people, some of them locals Rutherford had known his entire life, others just passing through on their way to somewhere else. The nation mourned. Investigators came to determine the cause. Engineers studied the collapsed structure and eventually concluded that a single eye bar in the suspension chain had fractured due to a combination of stress corrosion and manufacturing defects, leading to a catastrophic failure. But for Rutherford and many others in Point Pleasant, the technical explanation wasn't enough. The creature had appeared 13 months before the bridge collapse. It had been seen dozens of times, always in the same area, always exhibiting the same strange behaviors. It had communicated with at least one person, delivering a message that, in hindsight, clearly related to the disaster. The coincidence was too great to ignore. In the weeks and months following the collapse, Rutherford tried to move forward with his life, but guilt weighed on him constantly. If he'd understood the warning sooner, if he'd been able to interpret they fall correctly, could he have saved lives? Should he have been more vocal, more insistent about the danger? He knew logically that no one would have listened, that evacuating a major bridge based on cryptic words allegedly spoken by a winged creature was not a realistic option. But logic didn't ease the burden he felt. The Mothman was never seen in Point Pleasant again after that March night when it delivered its warning to Rutherford. Whatever it had been, whatever purpose it had served, it seemed to have completed its mission. The strange lights at the TNT area stopped appearing. The unsettling dreams that had plagued so many residents ceased. The town slowly began to heal from the trauma of the bridge collapse, though the scar it left would never fully fade. Rutherford kept his notebook, though he never added another entry after December 15th, 1967. Sometimes he'd take it out and read through his meticulous documentation of sightings and encounters, trying to find meaning in the pattern, trying to understand what they'd all witnessed during those 13 months. The answer never came. Years passed. The Silver Bridge was never rebuilt in the same location. A new bridge was constructed upriver, modern and safe, with redundant systems designed to prevent the kind of catastrophic failure that had taken so many lives. Point Pleasant moved on, as towns do, though it never forgot. The story of the Mothman became part of local folklore, told and retold with varying degrees of accuracy and embellishment. Rutherford and Lenora stayed in Point Pleasant for the rest of their lives. They never spoke much about the creature after that December night, but it was always there between them, an unspoken knowledge that they'd witnessed something beyond normal understanding. Sometimes, late at night, Rutherford would stand at his kitchen window, the same window where they'd seen the creature in their backyard, and he'd scan the darkness for any sign of those glowing red eyes. He never saw them again. He died in 1993 at the age of 58, his heart giving out while he was working on a neighbor's truck. Lenora found him in the garage, tools still in his hands. Among his possessions, she discovered the old notebook, its pages yellowed and fragile with age. She read through it one final time, remembering those strange months when the impossible had walked through their town. Then she carefully placed it in a box with his other personal effects. The notebook still exists somewhere, passed down through family or perhaps donated to a local historical society. The entries document a period of time when Point Pleasant, West Virginia, became the center of a mystery that remains unsolved to this day. What was the Mothman? Why did it appear when it did? Was it truly trying to warn of the coming disaster, or have we imposed meaning onto random events because humans are pattern-seeking creatures who need their stories to make sense? The old TNT plant still stands, abandoned and slowly crumbling back into the earth. People still visit sometimes, drawn by the legend, hoping for their own encounter with the unknown. Most leave disappointed, having seen nothing but abandoned buildings and overgrown forest. But a very few, report seeing something in the shadows between the trees, something with eyes that glow red in the darkness, watching, always watching. And every December 15th, on the anniversary of the bridge collapse, some people in Point Pleasant still claim to see strange lights moving through the woods near the river. They say the Mothman returns to mark the tragedy, to remind everyone of what happened and what was lost. Whether these sightings are genuine or wishful thinking or simple misidentification of natural phenomena, no one can say for certain. What we do know is that 64 people got into their cars on a cold December evening in 1967, planning to cross a bridge they'd crossed hundreds of times before, thinking about what they'd have for dinner or what was on television that night. Ordinary thoughts on what should have been an ordinary day. They never made it to the other side. And in the months leading up to that tragedy, dozens of credible witnesses reported seeing something that shouldn't exist, a creature that defied explanation but seemed to carry a message no one could fully understand until it was too late. The truth, as always, remains elusive. The evidence is there in old newspaper clippings and police reports and the memories of those who were there. But evidence and truth aren't always the same thing. Point Pleasant experienced something during those 13 months. Whether it was a biological anomaly, a psychological phenomenon, a supernatural visitation, or something else entirely, we may never know. What we do know is that the people who saw it were changed by it, marked by an encounter with something that existed outside the boundaries of their normal world. So, what do you think? Was the Mothman a harbinger of disaster, trying to warn people of the coming tragedy? Was it simply a misidentified animal that happened to appear during a time of heightened anxiety? Or was it something else, something we don't have categories for, something that exists in the spaces between what we know and what we think is possible? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you've ever experienced something similar, if you've ever seen something that changed the way you understand reality, share your story. You're not alone in what you've witnessed. Stay with us for the next tale. Until then, remember that sometimes the things we see in the dark are trying to tell us something. Whether we can understand the message before it's too late, well, that's the real question, isn't it?